In this experiment, two main independent variables were assigned to each participant, meaning that these variables make up an independent measures design, where each participant only takes part in one of the independent measures of the experiment. One of these measures is the empathy condition, which focuses on whether or not the individual has high or low empathy. This was determined by an online version of the IRI, a self-report that we mentioned before, which has 28 main questions to determine an individual's level of empathy. The other main independent variable is the treatment that the participant receives, which is either the oxytocin solution or the placebo, which is a saline solution. Then, there were also an additional two independent variables that were either part of the first portion of the experiment or the second portion of the experiment that every participant would take part in, meaning that these variables would make up a repeated measures design where each participant would take part in every level of these independent variables. For the first part of the experiment, the independent variables were whether the approaching figure, which we will talk about soon, was a friend, a ball, an authority figure, or a stranger. The independent variable for the second part of the experiment was the distance between the chairs, the distance between the chairs and the plant, the angles of the chairs, and the angles of a table to the plant in an image, which we will talk about soon. Apart from these four independent variables, two dependent variables were watched during the experiment as well. In the first part of the experiment, the preferred distance of the different approaching figures that the participant chose were recorded. In the second part of the experiment, the preferred picture choice depending on the chair distances in centimeters and the chair and plant distances in centimeters was recorded.
This experiment is a lab experiment, and it takes place in a controlled environment. Therefore, there are many necessary items that this experiment will need to standardize its experience and reach its goals. Perry used oxytocin and saline solution, which can be used intranasally, meaning it was taken through the nose, the online interpersonal reactivity index, and a quiet room that had Israeli nature magazines in it. Then, Perry also used a computerized version of the Comfortable Interpersonal Distance, or CID, scale for the first part of the experiment, and prepared colored pictures of rooms for the second part of the experiment. Participants attended the study twice, exactly 1 week apart, on the same day and time. This is when they would sign an informed consent form and would be randomly assigned to either the oxytocin condition or the saline condition. The oxytocin condition would be the experiment group, while the saline condition would be the control group. Then, these two conditions would be counterbalanced, meaning that half of the participants in each group would do the first experiment the first week and the second experiment the second week, while the others would do the second experiment the first week and the first experiment the second week. This allowed Perry to control for order effects and ensure that the results of the experiments were not due to extraneous variables. Before the experiment began, each participant arrived at the testing location and would then go into a quiet controlled testing room alone, where they would have 3 drops of either oxytocin or saline solution put into each of their nostrils, depending on which independent variable their group was to receive. This portion of the experiment was carried out through a double-blind procedure, which means that neither the participant nor their experimenter knew which condition the participant was a part of, or which solution was put into each of the participants' nostrils. Then, for safety precautions, they were watched to ensure that there were no side effects to the solutions that had just been put into their noses. It is important to note that none of the participants had any reactions to the solutions. Then, each participant had to wait 45 minutes to allow the oxytocin solution to reach a plateau level in the central nervous system. In the meantime, they were to complete the IRI so that their experimenters would be able to place each individual into a high or low empathy group. They were also instructed to read magazines during the wait. After the 45-minute wait, each participant began one of the 2 experiments.
The first experiment used the computerized version of the original CID to measure the preferred interpersonal distances between participants and people and objects. In this part of the experiment, the participant would be shown the name of the approaching figure for 1 second. The approaching figures were as follows: a stranger, a friend, an authority figure, or a rolling ball. Then, a fixation point would be shown for the participant for half a second. After the participant had their eyes glued to a certain portion of the screen, they then were shown a still picture of a circular room with the aforementioned figure in the center of the screen. The figure was shown approaching the center of the screen from one of 8 entrances from around the circle for 1 second. The participant had been told to imagine himself as the figure shown in the center and was instructed to press the spacebar on the keyboard in front of him to indicate when he would like the figure to stop approaching him. The animation of the figure approaching the participant lasted for a maximum of 3 seconds and had either stopped at the point when the figures collided or when the participant had pressed the spacebar. Each of the 4 figures appeared at all 8 of the entrances on 3 different occasions during the experiment, meaning each figure had 24 trials. Then, depending on where the participant stopped the approaching figure, a percentage was calculated of the distance remaining between the center figure and the approaching figure. On this scale, a 0% meant that the figures collided, and a 100% meant the spacebar was pressed immediately.
In the second experiment, the participants were told that they would be asked to sit in a room with another participant to discuss personal topics with them, and that they would be shown 2 pictures of rooms that looked very similar, but they had to pick which one they would like to use for the discussion. Then they were told that a computer program would create an average room based on all their choices that would be created 2 weeks after the experiment, so that the participants could return to discuss the personal topics. However, it is important to know that the discussion never actually took place, and that the participants were debriefed after 2 weeks about the real purpose of this experiment. In this part of the experiment, the participants were shown colored pictures of 2 very similar rooms. Each room consisted of 2 chairs, a table on the right side of the room, a plant on the left side of the room, a closet, a lamp, and a clock. The pictures varied based on 4 different conditions: the distance between the chairs, from 20 centimeters to 140 centimeters in 20 centimeter intervals, the distance between the chair and the plant, ranging from 200 centimeters to 320 centimeters in 20 centimeter intervals, the angle that the chairs faced each other, which was either 0 degrees, where both chairs faced forward, 45 degrees, or 90 degrees, where both chairs directly faced each other, and the angle of the table to the plant, which was either 0 degrees, 45 degrees, or it was 90 degrees. Each of the distances was compared with every other distance, and the 3 other variables were always the same in both pictures, but chosen randomly. In the end, 84 pairs of pictures were shown to each participant twice. This means that each participant picked from 168 pairs of photos. The procedure for this experiment is very similar to the first one. A fixation point would appear for half a second. The participant was shown 2 rooms on the screen for 2 seconds, and then the participant was asked to choose the left or right picture, depending on which one they preferred. The average preference for each participant was calculated for the preferred distance between the 2 chairs, the preferred distance between the table and the plant, and the preferred angle for each furniture pairing.
Here's an example of 2 pairs of rooms that participants could have seen during the experiment. As you can see in the top picture, the distance between the plant and the table changes between the 2 pictures. However, all the other variables remain the same, such as the chairs staying the same distance and angles, and the plant and table not changing angles despite changing distance. Then, similarly in the bottom picture, you can see that the only variable that was changed was the distance between the 2 chairs. Keep in mind that there were 82 other pairs of this imaginary room. For the first experiment, it was found that each pairing was significantly different from the rest, except for the friend versus ball pairing. Also, while there was no significance relating to the interaction between empathy and treatment, there was a trend of decreased mean distance between oneself and the approaching figure when comparing the high empathy group with the oxytocin solution to the high empathy group with the saline solution. On the other hand, there was a trend towards low empathy in the oxytocin solution, as it increased the mean preferred distance compared to the saline solution. Overall, There were also significant interactions between the treatment administered, the conditions given, and the empathy level of the participants. For example, as you can see in this bar graph, the group with the high IRI, or high empathy, is on the left, and the group with the low IRI, or low empathy, is on the right. The blue bars represent the groups that received the placebo, and the red bars represent the groups that received the actual oxytocin solution. Overall, we can see that with or without the oxytocin, the group with the high empathy on average felt more comfortable with having people closer to them than the group with the lower empathy, since they have lower bars. We also can see that the group that received the oxytocin had preferences that were more extreme compared to their corresponding placebo groups. This is obvious as the high empathy group allowed the figures to get even closer to them after receiving oxytocin, which is shown by the lower bar, and the low empathy group wanted the figures to be further away from them after receiving oxytocin, which is shown by the higher bar.
It has been noted that participants across all groups allowed a friend closer to them than a ball, followed by an authority figure and then a stranger. One hypothesis for this that Perry mentions is that this interaction could have been because the perceived threat of each one increases in that order. For example, this hypothesis would suggest that since a ball is more threatening than a friend, participants wanted it further away from themselves. However, Perry was unable to find enough evidence to support this claim. What she did find when looking for support for this hypothesis was that the oxytocin effect was most pronounced with the ball figure. Perry concluded that this was because balls are associated with pleasant social interactions. So, the ball, in this case, could have been perceived by participants as an invitation to social interaction. For the second experiment, Perry reported that there was a significant result for chair distances. The participants in the high empathy group chose significantly closer chair distances when giving oxytocin compared to the participants in the low empathy group who were given oxytocin. Other than that, however, no other comparisons were statistically significant. Within the high empathy group, there was a trend towards the oxytocin decreasing interpersonal distance when compared to the effect of the placebo. Finally, there was a moderately positive correlation found between the average distance in the placebo treatments in Experiment 1 and the average chair distance chosen in the placebo treatments in Experiment 2. This proves that the same effect was being tested in both experiments. Similar to the last bar graph, the colors and groups here remain the same. However, this graph specifically focuses on the chair distances between the placebo and oxytocin groups. So, as you can see here, the high empathy group on average preferred for the chairs to be closer after receiving oxytocin compared to those who were given the placebo. This is shown by the red bar being shorter than the blue bar on the left. Then, the low empathy group on average preferred the chairs to be further after receiving oxytocin compared to those who were given the placebo. This is shown by the red bar being taller than the blue bar on the right. Perry concluded that giving oxytocin to individuals with high empathy may have opposite effects on the enhancement of social cues compared to individuals with low empathy. People with high empathetic abilities tended to have smaller zones of interpersonal distance, especially after they were given oxytocin, while people with low empathetic abilities tended to have larger zones of interpersonal distance, especially after they were given oxytocin. Therefore, Perry shows that there is some support for her social salience hypothesis, which, as stated before, was that if oxytocin can increase our awareness of social cues, then it should have many different effects on interpersonal situations, as well as how one perceives social situations and reacts to them depending on where they are.